stood in the doorway of Hangar 7, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the concrete floor. At 62, she still carried herself with the straight-backed posture of a career Air Force pilot, though 25 years of retirement hadn't been kind to her joints. Her weathered P-51 Mustang, Liberty Belle, sat silent in the center of the hangar like a sleeping giant. Today was supposed to be the end. After decades of flying, the old Warbird at air shows across the country had finally made the hard decision. Liberty Belle would be sold to a museum in California, where she'd spend her remaining years as a static display. The thought made chest tight. "You sure about this, Mags?" asked Tommy, her longtime mechanic and friend. He'd driven up from Phoenix specifically for this final flight. At 58, Tommy had been working on Warbirds almost as long as had been flying them. "The insurance costs alone are killing me," replied, running her hand along the Mustang's polished wing. "And my eyes aren't what they used to be. Doc Martinez says I've got the beginnings of cataracts." Tommy shook his head. "That plane's in your blood, you can't just walk away." But had already made up her mind. She'd been flying Liberty Belle for 30 years, ever since she'd bought the restored fighter with her military retirement pay. Back then, she'd been one of only a handful of women flying Warbirds on the air show circuit. The other pilots had made sure she knew it too. "Hey, Grandma, you sure you can handle that big airplane?" they'd say. Or worse, "Maybe you should stick to something more your size, like a..." Had proven them wrong time and again. She'd won aerobatic competitions, set speed records, and earned the respect of pilots half her age. But those days were behind her now. The plan was simple. One last flight around Carson Valley, Nevada, where she'd made her home for the past 15 years. Tommy would follow in his truck to the small airfield outside town, where the transport company would load Liberty Belle onto a trailer. By evening, the plane would be on her way to California. Pulled on her leather flight jacket, the same one she'd worn during her Air Force days. The patches were faded now, her squadron insignia, her pilot wings, a small American flag. She'd been captain then, flying transport missions and breaking barriers in a man's world. The young hotshots at the air shows didn't know about her military service. They just saw an old woman trying to play pilot. "Ready when you are," Tommy called out, having completed his pre-flight inspection. Climbed into the cockpit with practiced ease, despite her creaking knees. The familiar smell of aviation fuel and old leather wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket. She'd sat in this seat thousands of times, but today felt different. Final. The Merlin engine coughed to life with a roar that shook the hangar walls. Felt the old thrill run through her as 1,200 horsepower vibrated through the airframe. Whatever else happened, she'd always have this moment. She taxied out slowly, savoring every bump and vibration. The local air traffic controller, a young man named Jake, came on the radio. "Liberty Belle, Carson Tower. Winds light and variable. You're cleared for takeoff runway 27. Have a good flight, ma'am." "Thanks, Jake. This is the last dance for this old girl." "Copy that. She's a beautiful airplane, ma'am. Shame to see her go." Lined up on the runway and pushed the throttle forward. Liberty Belle surged ahead, her engine howling. At 80 miles per hour, pulled back on the stick and they were airborne. The Nevada landscape spread out below them, sagebrush desert dotted with small ranches, the Carson River winding silver through the valley. To the west, the Sierra Nevada mountains rose like a wall of granite and snow. Had flown this route hundreds of times, but today she tried to memorize every detail. She climbed to 5,000 feet and leveled off, adjusting the throttle and prop pitch by feel. Modern planes had computers to do this work, but the P-51 was pure pilot and machine, connected by stick and rudder, throttle and instinct. For 30 minutes, flew lazy circles around the valley, saying goodbye. She buzzed the old Miller Ranch, where Hank Miller always came out to wave. She flew over the elementary school, where the kids would press their faces to the windows. She even made a pass over the Carson Municipal Airport, where a few local pilots had gathered to watch. But as she turned toward home, her radio crackled with an urgent transmission. All aircraft, this is Carson Emergency Services. We have a medical emergency at the Riverside Summer Camp. Need immediate airlift for a child with severe allergic reaction. Nearest helicopter is 40 minutes out. Any aircraft capable of landing on the camp's grass strip, please respond. His heart jumped. She knew the camp, a small facility about 20 miles north of town, nestled in a narrow valley. The airstrip was just a mowed field, barely suitable for small planes. But she also knew that 40 minutes might be too long for a child in anaphylactic shock. Carson Emergency, this is Liberty Bell. I'm 10 minutes from the camp. What's the situation? Liberty Bell, we have an 8-year-old boy, bee sting, severe reaction. Parents en route but stuck in traffic. We need to get him to Carson General immediately. Banked hard toward the north. Below her, Tommy's voice came over their private frequency. Mags, what are you doing? That grass strip is tiny and you've got a tail dragger. It's risky. Kid's life is on the line, Tommy. Let someone else handle it. You're not responsible for every emergency. But was already descending, scanning the narrow valley ahead. She could see the camp's buildings, the small grass airstrip carved out of the sage brush. It was short, maybe 1,500 feet, and rough. The P-51 was designed to land on aircraft carriers, but this would be tight even for her. As she approached, she could see the camp counselors gathered near the strip, one of them holding a small figure wrapped in a blanket. The boy, probably. Time was running out. Keyed her radio. Carson Emergency, Liberty Bell is inbound. Have the child and a guardian ready for immediate transport. This is going to be fast. She dropped the landing gear and flaps, slowing the big fighter to just above stall speed. The ground rushed up as she flared over the threshold, touching down hard but straight. The Mustang bounced once, then settled, her tires throwing up clouds of dust as stood on the brakes. She'd done it, but as she taxied toward the waiting group, realized the hard part was just beginning. The P-51 Mustang rolled to a stop just 50 feet from where the camp counselors waited. Could see them clearly now, 3 adults and the child, a small boy whose face was swollen and blotchy. Even from her cockpit, she could tell he was struggling to breathe. She kept the engine running as she popped the canopy. The camp director, a sturdy woman in her 40s, ran toward the plane with the boy in her arms. "Are you the pilot?" the woman shouted over the engine noise. "Yes, ma'am, get him in quick." But as the woman approached, her face changed. She stopped short, staring at with obvious shock. You're just an old woman." The words hit like a slap. She'd heard variations of this her entire career, but right now, with a child's life hanging in the balance, it stung worse than usual. "Ma'am, I'm a licensed pilot with over 40 years' experience. That child needs to get to a hospital now." The camp director hesitated, looking back at her colleagues. One of them, a young man barely out of college, shook his head vigorously. "We can't put in that old plane with her," he called out. "What if she can't handle it? What if something goes wrong?" Felt her temper flare, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Sir, the nearest helicopter is still 30 minutes away. This boy doesn't have 30 minutes." The camp director looked torn, still holding the wheezing child. In those few seconds of hesitation, made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. "Look, I understand your concerns," she said, her voice steady despite her frustration. "But I've been flying longer than you've been alive. I was a military pilot before I ever touched this Warbird. That child is running out of time." The director finally nodded and moved toward the plane, but it was too late. As she lifted the boy toward the cockpit, his small body went limp. His breathing had stopped. The woman's scream cut through the engine noise. The young counselor rushed forward, immediately starting CPR on the small boy. Within minutes, they had him breathing again, but barely. The camp director looked up with tears in her eyes. "The helicopter's landing now," she said. "We're going with them." Looked up to see the medical helicopter settling onto the far end of the grass strip. The paramedics were out and running before the rotors stopped spinning. They had on a stretcher, and IV started within minutes. As the helicopter lifted off, sat alone in her cockpit, the weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders. Those precious seconds of hesitation, because she was old, because she was a woman, because they didn't trust her, might have cost that boy his life. She taxied back to the other end of the strip and took off, her hands shaking slightly on the controls. The flight back to Carson took only 8 minutes, but it felt like hours. Tommy was waiting when she landed, his face grim. "I heard the radio chatter," he said as she climbed out. "How's the kid?" "Don't know yet," pulled off her helmet, her silver hair matted with sweat. "They wouldn't let me take him, Tommy. Said I was too old." Tommy's face darkened. "That's bull, Mags. You're the best pilot I know." "Doesn't matter what I know if they won't trust me to do it." They spent the rest of the afternoon in quiet preparation for Liberty Bell's departure. The transport truck arrived at 4 o'clock, a massive semi-trailer with special equipment for loading aircraft. Watched in silence as they winched her beloved Mustang up the ramp and secured it for the journey to California. But as the truck was pulling away, Tommy's cell phone rang. He answered it, spoke briefly, then turned to with a strange expression. "That was at the hospital," he said. "Was Tommy's wife, who worked as a nurse at Carson General. The kid's going to be okay. They got him stabilized just in time." Felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by a stab of guilt. If she'd been faster, if she'd been more persuasive, if they'd trusted her. "There's something else," Tommy continued. "Heard the camp director talking to the doctors. She's telling everyone that you were too old to be flying, that you looked confused and shaky. She's saying it's dangerous to have pilots like you still in the air." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Not only had they refused her help, now they were spreading lies about her competence. After 4 decades of safe flying, after proving herself over and over again, she was being dismissed as a doddering old woman who had no business in a cockpit. That evening, sat alone in her small house on the edge of town, staring at the empty hangar through her kitchen window. For the first time since retiring from the Air Force, she felt truly defeated. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was time to accept that her flying days were over. But then her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Is this?" The voice was young, male, and urgent. "Speaking." "Ma'am, this is Dr. Park at Carson General. I treated the boy from the camp today. I heard what happened out there, and I wanted you to know something." Waited, her heart hammering. "The camp director was wrong to hesitate," Dr. Park continued. "That child was minutes away from complete respiratory failure. If you'd been able to transport him immediately, it might have made all the difference. I've looked at your record, ma'am. You're one of the most experienced pilots in the state. What happened today wasn't about your ability, it was about their prejudice." After the doctor hung up, sat in her kitchen for a long time, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Liberty Bell was gone, heading toward retirement in a museum. But something inside had awakened, a fierce determination she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't ready to be put out to pasture, not yet. The next morning brought unwelcome news. Was drinking her coffee and reading the local paper when she nearly choked on the headline. "Elderly pilot refused emergency transport, child's life hanging in balance." The article was worse than the headline. It painted as a reckless old woman who had appeared at the emergency scene in an antiquated military aircraft and been deemed unfit to transport the injured child. The camp director, Susan, was quoted extensively. "She looked confused and shaky," had told the reporter. "Her hands were trembling and she seemed disoriented. I couldn't in good conscience put life in danger with someone who clearly shouldn't be flying anymore. We need better oversight of elderly pilots. There was no mention of military service, her perfect safety record, or the fact that she'd volunteered to help when no one else was available. The article made it sound like she'd forced herself into the situation and then been rightfully rejected. His phone started ringing at 7 a.m. and didn't stop. Most of the calls were from neighbors and friends offering support, but there were others, reporters wanting her side of the story, and worse, anonymous callers suggesting she should hang up her wings before she kills someone. By noon, the story had been picked up by the regional news. A television crew showed up at her house, but refused to talk to them. She knew how these things worked. They'd edit her words to fit whatever narrative they wanted to tell. Instead, she drove to the airport where she'd kept Liberty Bell. The hangar felt empty and cold without the Mustang's familiar presence. She was standing there, lost in thought, when Jake Wheeler walked in. Jake was the air traffic controller who'd cleared her for takeoff the day before. "Mrs., I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to talk to you." Turned surprised. Jake was maybe 25, fresh-faced and earnest. "What can I do for you, son?" "It's about yesterday. I heard the whole thing on the radio, and I want you to know what you did took guts. That camp lady is dead wrong about you." "Jake, I appreciate that, but—" "No, ma'am, please let me finish." Jake's voice gained strength. "My grandfather was a P-51 pilot in World War II. He used to tell me stories about pilots like you, the ones who could land anywhere, anytime, because lives depended on it. What you did yesterday, landing on that short grass strip in a tail dragger, that was real flying. Most of the young hotshots around here wouldn't even attempt it." Jake pulled out his phone. "I've been doing some research on you, ma'am. Captain, Air Force Transport Command. Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 air medals, over 8,000 hours of military flight time. Why didn't you tell them who you were?" Shrugged, didn't seem relevant. "Didn't seem? Ma'am, you flew cargo planes into combat zones during the Gulf War. You were one of the first women to pilot heavy transports in hostile territory, and these people are questioning your ability to fly a sick kid to the hospital." That afternoon, Jake did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He called the local newspaper and told them exactly what he thought of their article. More importantly, he provided them with military record, which he'd obtained through public sources. The newspaper's editor, a man named Bill, was initially dismissive. But when Jake mentions decorations and her service record, attitude changed. He'd served in the military himself as a young enlisted man, and he knew what those medals meant. By evening, a correction had been posted online, and a follow-up article was planned for the next day. But the damage was already done. The original story had been shared hundreds of times on social media, and the narrative had taken hold. Elderly pilots were dangerous and needed to be grounded. Spent that evening at Tommy's house, sharing dinner with him, and they'd been her closest friends since she'd moved to Carson Valley, and they were furious about how she'd been treated. "You should sue them," said, stabbing her with unnecessary force. "That camp director slandered you in public." "Sue them for what?" replied. "For being scared, for not wanting to risk a child's life with someone they didn't know." "For being prejudiced," Tommy interjected. "Mags, if you'd been a 30-year-old man in that cockpit, they wouldn't have hesitated for a second." Deep down, knew Tommy was right, but knowing it and proving it were two different things. And even if she could prove it, what would that accomplish? The damage to her reputation was done. But as they were finishing dinner's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it, then looked up with wide eyes. "It's from my friend Carol at the hospital," she said. "She just heard something interesting. Apparently, Susan, the camp director, has been telling people that she's going to file a complaint with the FAA about you. She wants your pilot's license reviewed." Felt like she'd been slapped. A formal FAA investigation could mean months of paperwork, medical reviews, and flight tests. At her age, there was a real chance they might find some excuse to ground her permanently. Even if she was ultimately cleared, the process could take years. "She can't do that," Tommy said. "You didn't do anything wrong." "She can file a complaint about anything," replied quietly. "Whether it goes anywhere is another matter, but the filing alone becomes part of your record." That night lay awake staring at the ceiling. In just 2 days, her quiet retirement had been turned upside down. Her reputation was in ruins, her beloved airplane was gone, and now she faced the possibility of losing her pilot's license entirely. She thought about Dr. Park's words, that the camp director's hesitation might have cost precious time. She thought about Jake's research into her military record. And she thought about all the years she'd spent proving herself over and over again to people who saw her gender and age before they saw her skill. As dawn approached, made a decision. She wasn't going to fight this battle in the newspapers or the courts. She was going to fight it the only way she knew how, by proving, once and for all, that she was still the pilot she'd always been. But to do that, she was going to need an airplane. The next morning brought a surprise visitor to her door. She opened it to find a tall, lean man in his 30s wearing a crisp white shirt and aviator sunglasses. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a military officer. "Ma'am, I'm Colonel David, United States Air Force," he said, removing his sunglasses and extending his hand. "I was hoping we could talk." Studied his face, nodding the silver wings pinned to his uniform. "What can I do for you, Colonel?" "May I come in? This concerns your situation with the emergency response yesterday." Curious despite herself, led him to her small living room. Colonel declined her offer of coffee and got straight to the point. "Ma'am, I flew here from Air Force Base because of the news reports about yesterday's incident. More specifically, because of what I learned about your service record." He pulled out a tablet and scrolled through several documents. "Captain, Air Force Transport Command, 1982 to 2007. 25 years of active duty, including 3 combat deployments. You flew C-130s into some of the most dangerous airfields in Iraq and Afghanistan." Remained silent, unsure where this was leading. "Ma'am, you probably don't remember me, but we've met before. March 2003, Baghdad International Airport. You were flying supply runs into the airport while it was still under mortar attack. I was a young lieutenant then, part of the security detail." His eyes widened as the memory surfaced. "The food and medical supplies," she said slowly. "We were bringing in supplies for the refugee camps." "That's right. You made 4 trips that day, landing under fire each time. The Army guys said you were crazy to keep coming back, but you said people needed those supplies more than you needed to stay comfortable." Colonel leaned forward. "Ma'am, that day you saved hundreds of lives. Not directly, maybe, but those supplies kept people alive who would have died without them. And you did it without hesitation, despite the danger." "That was a long time ago, Colonel." "Not that long ago that you've forgotten how to fly, I'd bet." He stood and walked to her front window, looking out at the empty hangar in the distance. "I heard about your P-51, sold to a museum in California." "Yesterday, confirmed." "That's a shame. From what I understand, you're one of the best Warbird pilots on the West Coast. I've been asking around, other pilots speak about you with real respect." Felt a familiar frustration building. "Colonel, I appreciate your words, but what's done is done. The airplane's gone, and frankly, after yesterday's newspaper coverage, I'm not sure I want to deal with the public anymore." Colonel turned back to her, and she was surprised to see a slight smile on his face. "Ma'am, what if I told you I had a proposition? Something that might help restore your reputation and serve your country at the same time." "I'd say you're talking in riddles." The colonel sat back down and pulled up another document on his tablet. The Air Force is starting a new program, a civilian auxiliary for emergency response and pilot training. We need experienced pilots who can handle unusual situations, teach young aviators real stick and rudder skills, and respond to emergencies that military aircraft can't handle efficiently. He showed her the tablet screen which displayed a sleek, modern aircraft. This is a PC-12, a single-engine turboprop, fast, reliable, and capable of landing on short, rough strips. It's also equipped with medical transport capability. Studied the image. She'd flown similar aircraft during her later Air Force years. They were impressive machines, powerful enough to handle serious missions, but small enough for one pilot to operate. The program is called Civilian Air Response Team, CART. We're looking for qualified pilots to be based in rural areas, available for emergency response when military resources are unavailable or inappropriate. Medical evacuations, search and rescue, supply drops to remote areas. And you want me for this program? Ma'am, after yesterday, I'd say you're exactly what we need. A pilot with the skills to land anywhere, the judgment to assess risks properly, and the courage to help when help is needed. Was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd heard. Colonel, I'm 62 years old. I wear reading glasses and my knees crack when I stand up. Why would the Air Force want someone like me? Because experience matters, ma'am. Because there are situations where a young pilot's reflexes aren't as important as an old pilot's wisdom, and because you've already proven you'll show up when other people need help. He closed the tablet and fixed her with a steady gaze. The position comes with flight training on the new aircraft, regular proficiency checks, full medical and flight physicals, and a salary of $75,000 per year. More importantly, it comes with the authority and credentials to respond to emergencies without having to convince people you know what you're doing. The offer was tempting, but had been disappointed too many times to get her hopes up. What's the catch, Colonel? The catch is that you'd be the first pilot in the program. If it works, we'll expand it nationwide. If it doesn't, he shrugged. Well, let's just say success would be better for everyone involved. And the FAA complaint that the camp director is threatening to file. Colonel's smile widened. Ma'am, as a federal contractor with security clearance, you'd have certain protections against frivolous complaints. The Air Force doesn't like having its contractors harassed by people with agendas. That evening called Tommy and to discuss the offer. They met at the local diner, a small place where half the town seemed to gather for dinner. It sounds too good to be true, said, cutting her apple pie into small pieces. Why now? Why you? Maybe because of the publicity, Tommy suggested. The Air Force doesn't like bad press about their people, even retired ones. Or maybe, said a voice behind them, because she's exactly the kind of pilot they need. They turned to see Dr. Park, the emergency room doctor who'd called the night before. He was still in his hospital scrubs, obviously just off his shift. Dr. Park said, surprised, I didn't see you come in. I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I couldn't help overhearing. This Air Force program sounds like exactly what this area needs. He slid into the empty booth seat across from them. We've had 3 medical emergencies in the past month that required helicopter transport from Reno or Las Vegas. Each time, the delay could have been critical. But surely the hospital has its own helicopter service. Dr. Park shook his head. We're too small. The nearest medical helicopter is based in Reno, 40 minutes away on a good day. Weather or mechanical problems can make it much longer. A local pilot with the right equipment and training could save lives. He looked directly at, Ma'am, I've reviewed the medical records from yesterday's incident. That child was in serious trouble. If you'd been able to transport him immediately, it would have given us crucial extra time to prepare for his arrival. The camp director made the wrong call. As they left the diner, felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond just flying for the joy of it. The Air Force offer wasn't just about redemption or proving herself. It was about using her skills to make a real difference. But first, she had to pass their tests. 3 weeks later, found herself at Edwards Air Force Base in California, starring at the PC-12 that could become her new aircraft. The turboprop was sleek and modern, a far cry from the vintage Warbird she'd been flying. But as she walked around it, conducting her pre-flight inspection, she felt the old excitement building. "Nervous?" asked Master Sergeant Lisa, the flight instructor assigned to checkout. Was perhaps 40, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded of her old squadron commanders. "A little," admitted. "It's been a long time since I've flown something this sophisticated." "Ma'am, according to your records, you've got time in C-130s, which are a lot more complicated than this. The PC-12 is actually pretty straightforward once you get used to the systems." They spent the morning going through the aircraft systems, the turbine engine, the advanced avionics, the weather radar, and the medical equipment installation. The plane was designed for single-pilot operation, but it had capabilities that rivaled aircraft requiring full crews. "The beauty of this machine," explained, "is that it can land on grass strips as short as 2,400 feet, cruise at 280 knots, and carry a full medical team plus patient. It's like having a small airliner that can land almost anywhere." But the real test wasn't going to be the airplane's capabilities. It was going to be her own. Colonel had made it clear that she'd have to pass both written and practical exams that were typically given to pilots half her age. The Air Force couldn't afford to have their first CART pilot fail publicly. The written exam took place that afternoon in a sterile classroom at the base. Hadn't taken a formal aviation test in years, and she felt rusty as she worked through questions about weather, regulations, and aircraft systems. Some of the young military pilots taking other exams looked at her curiously, probably wondering what an old woman was doing there. But when the results came back, had scored 94 out of 100, higher than she'd hoped and better than she'd expected. The flight test was scheduled for the next morning. Spent the evening studying the PC-12's manual and trying not to think about what failure would mean, not just for her, but for the program that Colonel was trying to start. The test pilot was Lieutenant Colonel James, a veteran instructor with over 5,000 hours in military aircraft. He was polite but formal as they conducted the pre-flight briefing. "Ma'am, we'll start with basic aircraft handling, takeoff, climb, cruise, and landing. Then we'll move to emergency procedures, followed by a simulated medical evacuation mission." The first part went smoothly. The PC-12 flew like a dream, responsive, stable, and forgiving. Felt her confidence growing as they progressed through the test maneuvers. But then came the emergency procedures. "Engine failure on takeoff," announced, pulling the power lever to idle as they climbed through 500 feet. Training kicked in instantly. She lowered the nose to maintain airspeed, turned toward the nearest suitable landing area, and began the emergency checklist. The simulated engine failure was one of the most dangerous situations a pilot could face, especially in a single-engine aircraft. She executed a tight traffic pattern and landed smoothly on a parallel runway, bringing the aircraft to a stop with room to spare. "Very good," said, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. That was textbook. They continued with other emergency scenarios, electrical failures, instrument malfunctions, severe weather penetration. Each time, responded with the calm precision that came from decades of experience. But the final test was the most challenging, a simulated medical evacuation from a short, rough airstrip in mountainous terrain. They flew to a remote airfield in the Mojave Desert, where a team of military medical personnel waited with a patient. Actually, a training mannequin equipped with monitoring devices. The strip was barely 2,000 feet long, surrounded by hills, with a significant crosswind. "Ma'am," said as they approached, "this is similar to what you might face in a real emergency. Short strip, challenging terrain, time pressure, and people depending on you to get it right." Studied the approach carefully. The wind was gusting to 20 knots, nearly perpendicular to the runway. She'd have to slip the aircraft all the way to touchdown to maintain runway alignment. She set up a steep approach, using the PC-12's excellent low-speed handling to fly a tight pattern. As they crossed the threshold, she applied full aileron into the wind and opposite rudder, holding the aircraft straight despite the crosswind. The touchdown was firm but controlled. She reversed the propeller and applied maximum braking, bringing them to a stop with 300 feet of runway remaining. The medical team was waiting. They loaded the patient efficiently while kept the engine running. Within 3 minutes, they were airborne again, climbing toward the simulated hospital. As she leveled off at cruise altitude, made some notes on his clipboard, then looked at her with something approaching respect. "Ma'am, I have to ask, where did you learn to handle crosswinds like that?" "Iraq," replied simply. "Desert airstrips with shifting winds and incoming mortars. You learn to get on the ground fast and get back up faster." When they returned to Edwards, felt cautiously optimistic. She'd flown well, handled the emergencies properly, and completed the mission simulation successfully. But she wouldn't know the results until the next day. That evening, she called Tommy from her hotel room. "How'd it go?" he asked. "I think okay. Hard to tell with these military types, they don't give much away." "Mags, you've been flying longer than most of these guys have been alive. If anyone can pass their tests, it's you." The next morning, Colonel called her to his office, sat across from his desk, trying to read his expression as he reviewed her test results. "Ma'am," he finally said, "I have good news and challenging news." His heart sank. "I failed." "No, ma'am, you passed, quite impressively, actually." He turned the report around so she could see it. "Lieutenant Colonel rated your performance as exceptional, with particular praise for your emergency procedures and judgment under pressure." Relief flooded through her, and the challenging news. Colonel leaned back in his chair. "The challenging news is that your first assignment starts immediately. We've got a situation developing in Montana, a wildfire threatening a remote research station. The scientists need evacuation, but the strip is too short for our larger aircraft and too dangerous for civilian helicopters." He slid a folder across the desk. "Your new aircraft is being loaded with firefighting and medical equipment as we speak. You leave in 2 hours." Opened the folder and scanned the mission brief. The research station was located in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana, accessible only by a 1,800-foot gravel strip. The wildfire was moving fast, and weather conditions were deteriorating. "Sir, this seems like exactly the kind of mission you'd want a more experienced pilot for." Colonel smiled. "Ma'am, you are the more experienced pilot, and frankly, after what happened in Nevada, I think you're ready to show the world what real pilots can do." 2 hours later was airborne in her new PC-12, call sign Rescue 1, heading north toward Montana. The aircraft was equipped with everything she might need: medical supplies, emergency shelter, communications equipment, and even firefighting foam dispensers. As she climbed through the California mountains, thought about the journey that had brought her here. 3 weeks ago, she'd been dismissed as a dangerous old woman. Now she was flying a sophisticated aircraft on a genuine rescue mission for the United States Air Force. But the real test was still ahead. In Montana, she'd face conditions that would challenge any pilot, regardless of age or experience. And this time, there would be no doubt about whether people would accept her help. This time, she was coming with authority. The smoke was visible from 50 miles away, a towering column of black and gray that rose into the Montana sky like a terrible monument. Checked her GPS and radio frequency as she flew north through the mountain valleys, the PC-12 handling the turbulent air with reassuring stability. "Rescue 1, this is Bitterroot Fire Command," came the voice on her radio. "We have you on radar. What's your ETA to the research station?" "Fire Command, Rescue 1. I'm 15 minutes out. What's the current situation?" "Rescue 1, we have 6 scientists and 2 support staff at the station. The fire jumped the river about an hour ago and is moving toward them faster than expected. Wind is gusting to 30 knots. Visibility is dropping rapidly." Could see what they meant. Even at her altitude, the smoke was getting thicker. She switched on the aircraft's weather radar and saw the storm system that was driving the winds and making the fire behave unpredictably. "Fire Command, what's the condition of the landing strip?" "Last report from the station was that it's still clear, but barely. You'll be landing with the fire maybe a quarter mile away." As descended toward the research station, she could see the flames through the smoke, an orange wall advancing through the forest like a living thing. The small cluster of buildings looked tiny and vulnerable in the wilderness. She could also see the landing strip, a narrow ribbon of gravel carved out of the mountainside. It was shorter than anything she'd attempted in the PC-12, and the crosswind was going to be brutal. "Research Station, this is Rescue 1. I'm 3 minutes out. Have your people ready to move immediately upon landing." "Rescue 1, this is Dr. Sarah at the research station." The voice was calm but strained. "We're ready, but I have to ask, are you sure you can get us all out? There are 8 of us plus essential equipment." Did a quick mental calculation. The PC-12 could carry 8 passengers in an emergency configuration, but it would be tight. And with the short strip and high-density altitude from the heat, takeoff was going to be marginal. "Doctor, we'll make it work. Be ready to move fast." She set up for a steep approach, using every trick she'd learned in 40 years of flying. The crosswind pushed the aircraft sideways as she descended, and she had to crab into the wind to maintain runway alignment. At 200 feet above the ground, she could feel the heat from the fire through the aircraft's skin. The smoke was so thick she could barely see the runway threshold. But then her training took over, not just her Air Force training, but all those years flying the P-51 into small airstrips, all those moments when people had questioned her ability. She was going to prove them wrong one more time. She touched down hard but straight, immediately applying maximum braking and reverse thrust. The PC-12 decelerated rapidly, coming to a stop with just 100 feet of runway remaining. The research team was already running toward the aircraft, carrying bags and equipment. Doctor reached the plane first and was surprised to see she was a young Asian woman, probably in her early 30s. "Are you the pilot?" Doctor asked, then stopped short as she saw his gray hair and weathered features. For a moment braced herself for the familiar reaction. But Doctor's face broke into a relieved smile. "Thank God. I was worried they'd send some hotshot young pilot who'd try to show off and get us all killed. You look like someone who knows what she's doing." The loading went quickly. 8 people and their essential equipment filled the cabin to capacity. Did a rapid weight and balance calculation. They were at maximum gross weight, but still within limits. As she prepared for takeoff, she could see flames through the trees at the far end of the runway. The fire was maybe 200 yards away and moving fast. "Everyone strapped in back there," she called out. "Ready when you are," Doctor replied. Push the throttle to maximum power and release the brakes. The overloaded PC-12 accelerated slowly, sluggishly. She could feel the aircraft struggling in the thin, hot air. At the halfway point of the runway, they still weren't at rotation speed. Made a split-second decision. She pulled the aircraft off the ground earlier than normal, accepting the risk of a stall in exchange for getting airborne before running out of runway. The PC-12 lifted off with just 50 feet of runway remaining, climbing slowly through the smoke and turbulence. Behind them, could see flames spreading across the research station buildings. They'd made it out with minutes to spare. Rescue 1, Fire Command, nice work. We have you on radar climbing out safely. What's your destination? Fire Command, Rescue 1 heading to Missoula. We'll have these folks on the ground in 30 minutes. The flight to Missoula was routine, but as they descended toward the airport, Doctor came forward to the cockpit. I wanted to thank you, she said, and to apologize. Apologize for what? When I first saw you, I was relieved that you weren't some young cowboy pilot. But then I realized I was making the same kind of assumptions about age and competence that people make all the time, just in reverse. Smiled. Doctor, in my experience, assumptions are dangerous regardless of which direction they go. Better to judge people by what they do, not how they look. After landing in Missoula and seeing her passengers safely off the aircraft, called Colonel to report the mission's success. Outstanding work, he said. I knew we'd picked the right pilot for this program. Thank you, sir. What's next? Next, you go home and rest. But I suspect this won't be your last mission. Word is already getting around about what happened today. People are starting to understand what the CART program can do. That evening, flew the PC-12 back to Carson Valley, landing at the same airport where she'd taken off in Liberty Bell just a month earlier. A small crowd had gathered to watch her arrive, Tommy and Jake the air traffic controller, Dr. Park from the hospital, and a dozen other local residents. As she shut down the engine and climbed out of the aircraft, she was surprised to see Susan, the camp director who had refused her help and then slandered her in the press. Approached hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable. Mrs., I wanted to speak with you. Waited, curious to see what the woman would say. I owe you an apology, continued. I heard about what you did today in Montana, and I've learned about your military service, your experience, your record. I was wrong to doubt you, and I was wrong to say those things to the newspaper. Mrs., you were trying to protect a child. I can't fault you for that. But I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. If the same situation happened today, I would trust you completely. Paused, then added, in fact, I've already called the FAA and withdrawn my complaint. I told them it was based on incomplete information. As the crowd dispersed, stood beside her new aircraft, looking out at the Nevada mountains in the fading light. Tommy joined her, grinning widely. So, how does it feel to be officially back in the hero business? Thought about the question. A month ago, she'd been a forgotten old woman putting her beloved Warbird out to pasture. Tonight, she was a federal pilot with a mission and an aircraft capable of saving lives. It feels like I never really left, she said. I was just waiting for the right opportunity to prove it. Her radio crackled with an incoming message. Rescue 1, this is Carson Emergency Services. We have a hiker with a broken leg on Mount Charleston, about 40 minutes south of your location. Are you available for a medical evacuation? Looked at Tommy, who was already grinning and shaking his head. Some things never change, he said. Keyed her radio. Carson Emergency Rescue 1, I'm available and ready. Send me the coordinates. As she climbed back into the PC-12 and started the engine, reflected on how much had changed in just 1 month. She'd lost her beloved P-51, faced public humiliation, and nearly lost her reputation entirely. But in the end, those challenges had led her to something even better, a chance to use her skills in service of others, with the authority and resources to make a real difference. The old Warbird was gone, but the pilot lived on, and sometimes that's all that really mattered. 20 minutes later, Rescue 1 was airborne again, heading toward another mountain, another emergency, another chance to prove that experience, skill, and determination never really go out of style. In her headset, she could hear the familiar voice of Jake, the air traffic controller. "Rescue 1, you're cleared direct to Mount Charleston. Fly safe, ma'am." "Thanks, Jake. See you when I get back." Below her, the lights of Carson Valley sparkled in the darkness, and ahead lay the mountains where someone was waiting for help. Was exactly where she belonged, in the pilot's seat, flying toward people who needed her skills. At 62, she was just getting started.